this was about as bizarre and as easy as it gets.
So the number for me was a number that would allow me to never have to work.
I feel like we got top.
I went from a sale of $500,000 to in debt.
$192 million.
This is Built to Sell Radio with your host, John Warrillow.
Hey there, it's John Warrillow. Listen, if you're brand new to Built to Sell Radio, welcome. It's good to have you along for the ride. We've been doing this show now for 5 years. I've interviewed literally a different entrepreneur every week for the past 5 years. And I've taken some of their best practices, their tips and tricks and negotiation hacks, and distilled them all into a field guide. It's a book called The Art of Selling Your Business. And it is a little bit of a recipe card for you to punch above your weight when it comes to negotiating with an acquirer. You can get it at builttosell.com/selling. Fun story coming up with Adii Pienaar, who built a company called Conversio. Listen to how he was able to increase the value of his business by 35%. Just listen to the strategy he used to gin up the value of his company. He'll also talk about how many companies he went to in his long list of potential acquirers. I think the number may surprise you to some extent. He'll talk about 3 criteria he used to decide when to sell, a question we get a lot. He'll share some of the mistakes he made in the early days around pricing, which are thought-provoking. The difference between voluntary and involuntary churn and why both numbers are going to be important for any recurring revenue-based company. He'll talk about how he triggered the negotiation process, in particular, the importance of speaking at industry events in your category. 4 things that Adii looked at other than the value of his company that were important to him when he was evaluating letters of intent. So 4 intangibles to look for in a letter of intent. How to know, and this was a fun piece, how to know when an acquirer is serious about buying your business versus just kicking the tires. One very specific thing to look for in the title of the person approaching you to know whether they're serious or not. He also talks about how being 100% remote, as we all are these days, impacted some acquirers' view of the value of his company. And one thing that Pienaar refused to talk about in the process of the management meetings he went through prior to receiving letters of intent, this is the one thing, the one conversation theme that you absolutely must avoid with a potential acquirer. Here to tell you all about his fantastic exit from Conversio is Adii Pienaar. Adii Pienaar, welcome to Built to Sell Radio.
Thanks for having me, John.
Conversio, what did you guys do? Tell me about this product.
Yeah, so Conversio, we built email marketing automation for e-commerce brands, predominantly Shopify, but also WooCommerce, which was the company that I co-founded before I actually got stuck into Conversio.
So email marketing for e-commerce brands. So if I sell gym equipment on a website, I'm going to need to market to my people who bought gym equipment from me before. So somebody buys dumbbells, we want to convince them to buy a squat rack or whatever. Yeah. And I would need to cultivate that relationship and send email out to those guys. Is that the software that you have?
Yeah, exactly right. So we would essentially cover what I would call the full spectrum of what you should be doing for email marketing as an e-commerce brand. So like all of the automated things from kind of your first time visitor, joining your mailing list, trying to get you to purchase the first time, to kind of sending out periodic newsletters, right, on the kind of more manual side. But also things like when you abandon a cart, like sending you reminders, hey, John, there's stuff left in your carts. You really need to kind of exercise more. Here's dumbbells that, should be doing the trick.
You're
right?
fat, man.
Well, we never went, we luckily never went there. I'm sure, some of the brands that use the product, kind of went, but really like all of those things, everything that touched kind of your email, like we would be involved in. And, we try to consolidate all of those things in some kind of intelligent manner. And where we actually got started, and I think this might be interesting, is when I founded the company end of 2014. It was actually called Receiptful as a start before we rebranded to Conversio 2 years later. And the original idea was, and I had stumbled like in 2014, I actually stumbled onto an article that was tweeted by my friend and now my coach, Dan Martel, who's been on your show as well.
Yeah,
now that I remember the story. And he tweeted a link to an article that basically said email receipts are a missed marketing opportunity. And basically what it proposed was like, the likes of Amazon, they've always included like in your order confirmation, whenever you buy something, here's a squat rack, you're going to need a kind of your barbell, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they included that there. It wasn't a new idea, but nobody had built this for smaller merchants, right? If someone had it, they would probably kind of built this custom. And that's where we started. So we literally built a very simple product initially called Receiptful, and it just allowed you to initially actually include a discount coupon for a future purchase into the email receipt. And what we pioneered, at least in the kind of your Shopify ecosystem, was the ability to generate that discount coupon uniquely and on the fly. So every recipient got a once-off unique discount coupon for them, right? So it wasn't one of these generic things where it was like, Adii 15, which would give everyone whom I shared it with 15% discount, which made just that kind of, because you wanted to incentivize actual users in a way. So that's where we actually started. And, from building that product and getting that traction, we ultimately got into this kind of broader suite of tools that became this kind of, full spectrum, kind of automated marketing automation system.
Interesting. I know nothing about Shopify. So Shopify is based in Ottawa, Canada, where I'm from. I'm from Canada, not Ottawa. And like I see headlines about them all the time. I have no idea what they do. Like I know what Amazon does because I buy from them all the time. I have no clue what Shopify does. So can you explain in layman's terms what Shopify does and then how you got to be part of their ecosystem?
Yeah. So at the core, I would say Shopify is an e-commerce platform, which essentially means that they allow you as a merchant, as a seller online, to create a website that has a shopping cart that allows you to display kind of products, and then it takes orders and you can fulfill those orders, right? That's the kind of the core of it. And I think what Shopify have done really well over the years is they recognize that like it is impossible for them as a company to build every single thing that every single merchant needs. So they built this really fantastic, developer ecosystem and app store experience, which makes it very easy for a merchant, whether you're a newbie or you're $100 million brand, to actually just go into the app store and say, here's Conversio. It's got 800, 5-star ratings, whatever, like average rating of 4.7, whatever the case is. I need email marketing. I'm going to give this a go. So when and interestingly enough, and again, like this hurts me a little bit to this day, right? So, WooCommerce, my previous company, when we started with Receiptful back in the day, the first integration we built with WooCommerce only. And WooCommerce and Shopify are the two biggest e-commerce platforms in the world. And upon kind of, eventually kind of, selling, Shopify was about 90% of our business. So we could never, I always hope that kind of a little bit of nepotism almost within the WooCommerce and WordPress ecosystem would help drive more sales there. But for whatever reason, we could never, kind of make it work. But that's what those things essentially do. WooCommerce and Shopify, they're, e-commerce platforms that essentially fuels the kind of independent kind of Amazon sellers. So many sellers that are at Amazon might also have their kind of direct to consumer owned channel, which they run on something like a Shopify or a WooCommerce.
We talk a lot about something called the Switzerland structure, which is where if you become too dependent on a single partner supplier, it can undermine the value of your company. As you became more and more dominant with Shopify, more and more of your revenue, if I understood correctly, you said 90% of your revenue is coming from Shopify? Yep. How did you guys reconcile how dependent you were on Shopify?
Yeah. So, I guess it's always a little uneasy, right? And I guess the context there, John, is that, WooCommerce was built exclusively on WordPress. And WordPress is obviously slightly different to Shopify in the sense that it's open source, right? So if WordPress ever did something, we would have had the ability to make some changes, right? Whereas Shopify is an owned kind of closed platform at least. And if they made some changes that was detrimental to us, like it could pose significant risk. So the risk was there, but nothing, in either of those companies for that matter, like ever popped up where I felt that it didn't make sense to build these businesses on these platforms. Ultimately, like those platforms, the way I argued it with Shopify, right, was that, and especially after they became a listed company themselves, was that if they were to act in an unreasonable manner to us, right, I would just run to the first kind of TechCrunch or New York Times reporter. I would give them all the facts, and that would kind of would have dented their share price, right? Because a big part of their value was in the app ecosystem, right? So, and I'm not trying to inflate my own ego and worth here. Like we were just one of kind of hundreds of kind of app development partners. But point being, like I think for a company like that, if they don't have 100% track record with regards to how they handle the kind of the partners in their ecosystem, they suddenly start creating doubt. And I think the best example we've seen kind of years ago, right, was when Twitter was a flourishing platform. They had an amazing kind of API and developer ecosystem, and then they slowly started clawing back those rights, and all the developers left, right? Which meant that, like, if you look at innovation, Twitter compared to Facebook, and I'm not praising Facebook, I think there's many flaws there, but they've at least continued to progress the product and make kind of innovate on things, make progress, like try new things. Whereas Twitter's mostly stagnated for the last couple of years. And a big part of that is they totally overstepped their bounds with regards to this partner/developer ecosystem that they have. So that was always my theory in terms of trying to quantify that risk. And I said, it's a bit of an uneasiness because this can change. Sure. But then again, we also just existed because of that platform, right? So I think there's a kind of healthy tension there.
Yeah. How big did you get Conversio before you decided to sell in terms of revenue, number of employees, that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So by the time we sold, we were, I believe, 14 full-time team members, and a couple of $1 million ARR.
ARR standing for
annual
recurring revenue. So kind of top line recurring revenue. So a couple $1 million in annual recurring revenue, 14 employees. What triggered you to want to sell? Yeah,
that's a great question. I think a couple of things, John. The way I always describe it to people is the following way. I think firstly, a large part of, if I take the perspective from my family and our financial situation, a large part of our theoretical kind of wealth and our, in our financial portfolio got stuck in this business, right, called Conversio. And I was really uneasy about that, right? And that's not a kind of gun to my head uneasiness, but I was aware of that. And I have a finance background, all the way back to varsity, and I at least understand the basics of diversification, right? So I think that was the kind of the first part of it. The second part of it was really the fact that kind of, as a marketing automation platform, I think we found ourselves in probably the most congested, competitive space of the market in terms of software, right? It's very congested, very competitive. And I was aware of that. And I didn't necessarily know how well we could grow the company and how effectively we could grow the company as an independent, at least. And I think the last bit there, like almost the combo there, is the fact that I never felt that email marketing was my life's work either, right? And I think literally the combination of those things made me at least say, you know what, let's literally put my hand up and say, hey, we might be interested to sell. What would that transaction actually look like?
I want to explore this idea of reaching the kind of top of what you thought you might be able to do with the company. One of the things that I find curious about being part of an ecosystem like Shopify, and in your case, deriving the majority of your revenue, is at some point, I would imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, it would feel very restrictive, like you're at the behest of Shopify. Like if Shopify's traffic grows and they're successful, well, you will in lockstep benefit. And if Shopify has a bad month or a bad quarter, it's like, what do we do? We're kind of at the mercy of their traffic. And was that a sentiment that you were feeling when such a big portion of your revenue was coming from that ecosystem?
No, and I think to some extent, a big part of our growth was actually riding that wave in a positive sense, right? So Shopify's growth immediately added almost kind of organic growth for us by just being there, right? And I think, which is actually a negative, right? Because everything we all learn about business growth is you have to find those repeatable, scalable kind of tactics, channels, strategies, etc., to keep growing a business, right? And yet those have to change as you kind of level up. And I actually think, we had one major competitor in our space, for example. They were a couple of years ahead of us, I think about 3.5 years ahead of us, and they kept raising money, for example. And I knew from a personal kind of / lifestyle consideration, more realistic consideration, I knew that I didn't want to keep raising money. We raised a single round of money very early on, and I didn't want to keep playing that venture capital game because it wasn't going to align with the kind of company that I built. So, but with that in mind, knowing that our competitors, regardless of the organic growth and kind of this rising tide that we were all experiencing by just being in the Shopify ecosystem, we probably got our ass kicked by competitors as well. So, and I think it's in trying to assess that and then saying how much energy do I have as an independent? How much belief do I have as an independent? And how do I try and then time a good liquidity event that makes sense for kind of everyone here?
And so who's the everyone? You mentioned you raised some VC. What's the capital structure of the company look like at this point in the game?
Yeah, so we only raised a single round of capital. Upon exit, I still had the vast majority of the company, which was in our family office. And the other parts of it, about 30% of the company was held by, probably almost half, was held by those early investors, as well as team members. So that's really the kind of the everyone there. I would also not be almost kind of disingenuous by saying that, the ultimate deal, whilst everyone got the same or similar-ish terms, the extent of the exit was only going to be life-changing for me as a kind of the vast majority kind of holder of the shares. But there was still that kind of everyone consideration, right? I did want to return a healthy, albeit not unicorn kind of return to my shareholders, for example. I did want to make sure that team members got a nice kind of extra for having, been on that journey, contributed to its success, for example.
Got it. That's helpful for sure. When it comes to the wealth diversification piece, you were seeing the value of Conversio grow, and the percentage of your net worth is it's starting to get to be a big part of the pie. And so that was part of the trigger. That's helpful. What did you think the company might be worth? Before you went through the process of marketing it, did you have a sense of what other email marketing platforms are trading at? Any sense of what multiple it might be worth?
Yeah, so I think initially, I know a couple of brokers in the ecosystem and generally kind of sells SaaS solutions, sells software companies, and I think my expectation was around that kind of 2 to 3x kind of multiple on revenue. Assuming you're selling to a financial buyer, right? Because financial buyers just generally tend to be more prevalent compared to a strategic acquirer, right? But that 2 to 3x kind of top line revenue was I think the starting point, at least in terms of shaping my expectations of if I try to go to market in the quickest, easiest way tomorrow, that's probably what I would end up getting.
Got it. So where did you go from there? You have this, just before we go further, I'd love to know the other key metrics like churn. What was the churn rate, and how fast were you growing? You were at 2 million, but so it must have been growing fairly quickly if you started in 2014.
So I think it's sort of growth, and I can't remember the exact numbers, John. I think, we definitely had we exceeded, I think 20% growth year on year, like in the last like 12 months before selling, I believe. I can't remember how much at least. And what was interesting in the growth trajectory as well is we had incredible growth initially in that kind of first, say, 2.5 year journey, part of the journey, the first half of the journey. And then that growth trajectory changed during the second part, right? So I think
meaning it slowed down. You reached altitude and you were growing at a slower rate.
Exactly right. And I think part of that challenge, interesting enough, was churn. So our churn was never bad. I think like we consistently averaged, with a kind of SMB focused SaaS solution, we had about like averaged out 5% churn like over our lifetime, 5% kind of every month, right? Not annual kind of churn. So, but obviously at 5%, you're losing half your revenue every year and you need to replenish that, right? So to keep growing, like those numbers in terms of scaling, like that becomes harder, right? And a big part of that was, I think, and again, acknowledging some of the earlier mistakes we had made in terms of pricing and where we found ourselves in the market is we should have probably charged a little bit more, a little bit sooner, for example, because we had many stores, for example, both on Shopify and WooCommerce side, that they are so small. They start with us on our lowest plan, $20 a month, but they don't yet have anything to sell. And 2-3 months later, they churn out because they couldn't sell a single product. And that obviously had nothing to do with the product, them liking the product and finding value in the product. They just had so many other things as a new business that still had kind of there to figure out. So
kind of voluntary churn versus involuntary. For folks who don't know that space, voluntary is like the customer says, I don't like this platform, I'm going to go to this, an alternative platform. Involuntary is like they go bankrupt, they stop selling online, that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
So you had a lot of involuntary churn, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Did you ever try to parse of the 5% a month, what portion was involuntary versus voluntary?
We tried. We never had exact data, on it. I think the involuntary part, it was probably about 20% of our churn. So it wasn't the biggest problem that we had to solve. But I said, like, you take 1% off of that, you're suddenly looking at 48% a year kind of churn versus 60%, which already adds 12%, to your growth year on year.
So let me see if I can summarize where we're at this stage of the game. So you had a huge spike of growth right out of the gate, huge success, in large part riding the wave of Shopify. The growth starts to tail off a little bit, largely because of the churn. It's very hard to replace the leaky bucket. And so you're at a point where you're thinking, man, I this is a big part of my wealth. And I'm not seeing the trajectory of being able to, double every couple of years here. Like I'm starting to tail off. Maybe now's a good time to sell. Am I kind of summarizing a little bit like where your head was at?
Yeah.
I don't want to put words
totally
in your mouth. So if you,
nope,
we're good.
Yeah, no,
okay.
I think that's a good summary.
Okay. So what's next? Where do you go from here? Did you sort of proactively get on your front foot? How did you go from how does the story evolve from here?
Yeah. So what ultimately ended up happening was, I'll get my timing right here. In November 2018, I got invited to speak at a MicroConf in Europe, which was held in Dubrovnik, Croatia. And MicroConf being a community, I've spoken at it a couple of times. MicroConf being a community of mostly bootstrapped or self-funded software or technology entrepreneurs, at least. And at the conference, I actually sat down with Rob Walling, good mates of mine, told them, because Rob I think at that stage, he had probably just sold his company Drip, right?
Drip, I've had him on the show actually about 2 months ago. It was a great episode, really.
Exactly right. So everyone here knows that story, right? So I think at that stage, getting your time right, that was about a year after Rob had sold, and he was still working with Lead Pages, still working on Drip, and I took him through kind of where we were at with Conversio, kind of like the challenges that I had, the frustrations that I had, etc. And he actually suggested at that stage to chat to his now, a co-founder and partner in Tiny Seed, their investment fund, Einar Volset, who kind of also kind of acts as a broker, does many, is also a tech entrepreneur, went through Y Combinator himself, a couple of years ago, but really does this kind of via his company Discretion Capital, like helps software founders sell their businesses. So Einar and I think it was December 2018, January, kind of 2019, essentially kick off the process of at least starting to chat. Einar shapes that expectation again, kind of confirming that, that approximately kind of 3x rule of thumb at this stage, but then essentially kind of lays out the process of here's what this would look like, here's what we need to put together, here's how we would ultimately take the company to market, right? Which then kind of kicks off the process. So to your question, it was a proactive exploration from my part to say, like, I don't know how to sell this business. Who do I effectively need to help me get this business sold for, I wouldn't say even kind of maximum kind of your value, just in a transaction that actually makes sense for me.
And what's the difference, I guess? So a lot of people hearing that saying, aren't those synonyms, like maximize value, a deal that makes sense for me? So what was on your list of criteria for a deal that makes sense to you?
Yeah. So, I guess a couple of things, right? I think firstly, from a personal perspective, there are things like obviously the actual financial package. Is that cash or stock, right? What does that look like? What does the earnout look like? If there's anything like that, is it performance related? How long do I need to commit to the acquirer? So I think there's a couple of things there that's very much about me, right? But then for me, there was also other things. Is I really wanted to sell the product to someone that was going to take both the product and the team further, right? I wanted to sell to someone that was going to do right by my team. Like my team was incredibly important to me, and I think beyond the product, which I think was top notch, the biggest asset we had was the team and the culture that we had. So I wanted someone that would honor that and that can, again, like take that further, use that as foundation and kind of go further, with that. So I think that there are those other things that, ultimately that don't necessarily show up in, the ultimate documentation and the agreement, but that are hopes as well. Like the literally that kind of, the seller acquire fit or seller buyer fit kind of things. That was important to me, at least. I was never going to sell to someone just because they gave me a lot of money, but they were going to throw my team under the bus, for example. Like that was just not an option for me.
Not on the table. So from a value perspective, your head was kind of in the 2 to 3 times revenue. That was sort of what you were thinking. Cash versus stock. Were you 100% cash? Were you willing to accept some stock? What were you thinking there?
Definitely willing to accept some stock, and I ultimately did accept some stock as well. Yeah.
Earnout. How'd you feel about an earnout?
How do I feel about earnout for the process?
No. My question is, before the transaction, how did you feel about it, accepting an earnout? Was it something you'd be open to, or were you totally closed to it?
I guess realistically, I always knew that there was no way to sell a company for a really great valuation, right, or in a good transaction without like having me as CEO, as founder, being part of that process, right? So committing some part of that time to the acquirer always made sense. And I think just in terms of my personal values, that made sense as well, right? Is like, if I'm being true to my kind of, in saying that there are other things except just the transaction that mattered, like I would want to see through that transition at the very, very least. So it was definitely something I was realistic about. I was totally expecting it. I was also entirely hoping that it would be as short or as easy as possible, for example, right? So like I said, I knew that I was not going to get away from it, right? Unless I totally compromised on like the sales value of the company, right? But I was like, I had heard many stories, at least, about earnouts that didn't work as kind of as intended and as hoped, right? So, which kind of skews that perception to the point where, okay, let's just get this as uncomplicated and as short as possible.
So Einar, am I pronouncing his name correctly? Einar?
I hope so, because if you're not pronouncing it correctly, then I've not been pronouncing it correctly forever.
He's a Finnish guy, isn't he, or Norwegian?
Norwegian.
So Einar, his name has come up before on this show. Rob Welling's talked about Einar before, among other people. So you hire Einar, and he takes the business to market. What does he find? Like what's the reaction?
Yeah. So what we ultimately end up doing is, A couple of things is we compiled a one pager anonymously, right? That doesn't mention the company, just mentions some kind of highlights. So one pager, as well as a kind of extensive, I can't even remember what it's called. The acronym was a SIM, like
SIM, confidential information memorandum.
that's it, right? Like,
yeah.
That's
or SIP,
that's
confidential information presentation. They're the same thing.
Yeah. So we compile those two things, and then we also create a list. Probably I think about 150 potential acquirers. Like everyone from, this is a financial buyer to this is a potential strategic, right? And really not excluding anyone, right? So we didn't include Salesforce on there, for example, right? But I mean, Shopify was on the list, for example, even as a listed company at that stage. Realistically, like that could have been acquired, right? So really kind of no limits to that list. And then the process kind of ran. We just started outreach, doing our cold outreach, saying, here's the company, here's the one pager. If you want more, sign the NDA, we will send you the SIM, right? And at the time that we started outreach, we, like within that initial batch, we get a bite from a company that ultimately ended up bidding. And we also got inbound interest from campaign monitors, and campaign monitor is owned by Insight Partners, private equity firm. So we got inbound kind of ping from the private equity firm saying, would you be interested in chatting? And we had kind of pinged someone else at Campaign Monitor at that stage. So, and those two are then the companies that, were ultimately kind of in the bidding process to acquire, Conversio, and ended up being kind of where I had spent most of my time in terms of conversations. But even with that, like we kept doing outreach, and I had a few other conversations as well, that even though the conversations were progressing with Campaign Monitor and this kind of the other company that bid for us, like I still had other conversations as well. So we ultimately, I think we had serious interest from about 6 different companies in the end.
So you started with 150 on the long list, and then 2 inbound serious inquiries, and then another 4 relatively serious kind of conversations.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it. I've got 2 questions about that. First, what does a bite feel like? Like a fisherman, when you feel a bite, like it's an immediate tug on the rod, and you're like, okay, that was a bite. What does a bite in this process feel like? What is it? How do you know it's a bite?
Well, I think there's some sensibility to it, right? So, like, what I can, kind of, and this is not to kind of blow the smoke up, Campaign Monitor's ass, for lack of better words, right? But the fact of the matter is, when they came in, so I can describe this bite, right? When they came in, it was immediately a hell yes moment for me. Firstly, because, way back when I started in software with WeThemes, alongside Basecamp, like one of the kind of the aspirational companies that were out there was Campaign Monitor. I've been a user for, like, I think Campaign Monitor itself is 17, 18 years old this year. I've been a user for much of that, right? So I had huge brand affinity, firstly, right? That's the first part of it. The second part of it
my question is more less about why you react the way you do. I'd be curious. I think people would be curious to know, like in a sports context, if you are being recruited by a team, there's all sorts of different ways that you can get recruited. Everything from like the assistant coach sends you a generic email, which is not a good sign, to like the head coach coming to your town to watch you play baseball, as an example, in a baseball context, or rugby in your example. So what does it feel like? Like what is a buying signal for in this process that sounds real as opposed to just superficial? What is what was it in the Campaign Monitor?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And I'll go back to the Campaign Monitor example there, right? So beyond that brand affinity, then I think the other parts of it was the fact that this was a senior kind of person at the private equity firm, right? So it wasn't just, I say just a junior analyst. Obviously, there are many, like all analysts have to start somewhere, right? And I don't mean to demean that, but if it's an analyst, generally, like the decision hasn't been made, right? So I think that's the first part. Like the person reaching out is is likely involved in the decision. Whether they're the final decision maker, maybe not, but they are probably involved in the decision, right, at a high level. And that was true for everyone that we spoke to, right? So I think that's the first part of it. And the second part is that when I mentioned sensibility kind of check or sense check to it, which was, if this company were to buy us, like, what would they do with us, right? Could we even, like, without asking them, without them telling us, could we actually see how this would play out, right? So, with Campaign Monitor, this was obvious. Like, we knew that within kind of their product, their product wasn't perfectly suited to e-commerce. Like, whilst e-commerce merchants could use it, this immediately felt like, oh, this could be a great fit. Yes. So I think there's that bit to it where it's just like logically asking yourself, are they literally just fishing around, right? Or is there a play here, right? And can we kind of, put some parts of the narrative together without having, them sell us on it?
So it sounds like I'm going to kind of reverse engineer this. On your list of 150 potential acquirers, there were some where the strategic fit was dubious or questionable. Not dubious, but less strong than it was with Campaign Monitor. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly right. So, I mean, some of them, it would be more of a stretch, right? I mean, for example, I mentioned Shopify, could be a competitor, or it could be a potential acquirer at that stage. Realistically, I knew that this would be a stretch for them, right? Purely because there's other email marketing tools in the ecosystem. It would send the wrong signal to those, etc. Right? So there's a bit of that kind of almost a sniff test that says, this, it's possible, but unlikely, right? And I think in different kind of scenarios, like, you have to have that bit of a sniff test there. It's like, can you actually see this working post-acquisition?
I guess so. Some people listening to this are saying, okay, I get the sniff test and I get the strategic fit. So isn't the risk quite high in going to such a big list, 150 names, if you know that 50 of them are probably long shots? There's some people saying, why would you go to people, risk the disruption, risk the potential that your competitors and your customers are going to find out when you kind of know they're a long shot anyways? Like, do you know what I'm asking? Is there, some people are probably asking themselves that question. How do you answer?
Yeah, it was, honestly, that was never a concern, John. I don't think there's anything in our SIM that would have, that could have helped or given a competitor a leg up to compete against us, for example. Like, knowing what our churn is or knowing what our growth rate is, I don't think that's an issue, right? And like, I would also, again, like, this is unvalidated, but if I sent that document to our customers and I said, here's our financial performance, I also don't think they would have acted or made any other decision, right, in that regard, i.e. either churn or say, hey, like, you guys are so profitable, like, why don't you can charge us less, kind of thing, right? So I don't think that there was any of that information in there. And maybe like part of that mentality was just ingrained in, when we built With Teams to WooCommerce being open source, we always knew that people could literally buy our product and then they could fork it, i.e. they could copy it and they could rebrand it as their own, and then they can resell it, right? Like, that's what open source licensing allows you to do. And I think with that in mind, like, this idea of competition just felt, and putting information out there feels counterintuitive to me. I think in many things in business, like, you have to be not stupid, but somewhat vulnerable, at least, about like, how do you actually have a conversation if you're not going to add any information to that conversation? How are you going to start the conversation if you're not willing to take the first steps?
Got it. What was the most surprising thing you were asked prior to getting a letter of intent from Conversio and the other guys? What was the most surprising thing you were asked during this process of courting these potential acquirers?
I think probably in the realm of having a remote team. So we were remote and distributed. And I still like getting questions about how is this even viable to build a significant business with a remote distributed team? Like, that at least surprises me, right? Because I come from a place where, having built two businesses that have been remote and distributed, being amongst like now having incredible examples of really big businesses that are fully remote and distributed as well.
Shopify is pretty remote these days.
Exactly right. But I mean, even kind of pre-pandemic, right? Because we still sold pre-pandemic, right? There were still examples, Automatic, GitLab, Envision, 1,000 people plus companies that are fully remote. So I think that was always a surprise to me, that this kind of, why, I almost, to the extent where I don't really actually understand the question. It's just a team. We've obviously proven that we can work together. What's the matter?
That's really interesting. What's your best tip for people who are new to working remotely?
Probably, and I'll steal this from a friend of mine, Jason Cohen, who's the founder of WP Engine. And Jason, I caught onto this late in the sense that I don't think with WooCommerce we got this right, but then I was very proactive and kind of conscious of this with Conversio. But Jason once said that every team, every company has a culture, whether you know it or not. And just that notion of culture is ultimately the way we work together, and you might as well be explicit about it. So truly thinking through kind of what are your values as a team. How does that kind of relate to the culture that we create, the way that we work, the way we think about things? I think that's crucially important, because if you're not in physically the same space, and you can't literally kind of manage by kind of your bums and seats and kind of visibility, I think the only way to keep a team together is by keeping them close to those values, keeping them within that culture, really, because that's the thing that those shared values are the things that connects people and drives them forward to collaborate and do good work.
Got it. So let's go back to the sale. So you're thinking 2 to 3 times is probably reasonable. You're getting some interest, probably quite a bit of interest, it sounds like. What was your first round of letters of intent? How many did you get, and what was the sort of valuation range?
Yeah. So we first, there's LOIs that we got there, and again we had 2 bidders who from whom we got LOIs, right? Campaign Monitor being one of them, and the first range was pretty accurate. Was at the approximately that kind of 3x kind of revenue range.
What was your reaction to that?
What was the reaction? I mean, I guess it felt good, right? I mean, I think the first reaction, that kind of gut feel, is, it validates that we've built something that's worth something to someone else, right? And they're willing to pay significant money in terms of, at least in absolute terms, right? So there's a sense of relief in that, right? And just being validated. And then I think the second part of it kind of is kind of almost immediately afterwards, which is, okay, now let's start negotiating, kind of thing, right? So let's see kind of what we can now do, because this is only the starting point. And I think at least the fact that I understood that we were gonna run a process and we were gonna have multiple people hopefully bidding for the company, I knew that we were hopefully gonna get that kind of the ultimate price up. And interesting enough, and I'll share this only because I've mentioned Dan earlier, and I know he's been on your show as well. I was actually, whilst negotiating, at some stage, I was at one of Dan's SaaS Academy conferences.
This is Dan Martell you're referring to. I can't remember what episode of Built to Sell Radio he was, but you can Google Dan Martell Built to Sell Radio and go back and listen to it if you want.
Exactly. So I was at one of Dan's SaaS Academy conferences whilst I was negotiating, and he had invited someone, a founder, CEO who runs email marketing automation kind of tool, much bigger than Conversio, don't know how much, but they were on our list of acquirers as well. And I mean, similar to the kind of process that I ran with Einar, Dan, as my kind of business coach at that stage, he had proposed something very similar. You have to get multiple people involved in the process. And I actually go up, in a break, I go up to Dan and I said, listen, I'm not going to do this if you're not okay with this. It's your conference after all. But that founder, I totally going to go up to him and I'm just going to say whatever, his name is Pete. Say, Pete, we're in the process of chatting to acquirers for Conversio. Would you be interested? And I literally walked into him whilst he was in the kind of hotel lobby, just on his way out. I actually did that, right? Which I'm not kind of an extrovert to that extent. I'm not a salesperson either, but that's literally I think me understanding that process and understanding that a key part of getting the best deal possible was to get as many people engaged in the bidding process as possible. So
was Pete a third offer, or was he?
He wasn't interested. He said fire over the sum and he'll have a look, and there wasn't any interest in follow up after that. But like that's the extent. Like I literally kind of the outreach wasn't just kind of us sending emails and kind of spraying and praying. Like I coincidentally, right? But I was at a conference and I actually went up to a potential acquirer in person, right?
So let me get this straight. So you've got 2 offers. So it's not like you've got 20 offers, but you got 2. So better than 1, but it's not 20, right? So so let me see how you play this. Because on one hand, both offers, it sounds like, was there much difference between the 2, or were they both in and around that kind of 3 times top line?
So they kept following, in terms of total valuation, they kept following each other. I guess as context as well, Campaign Monitor being a truly strategic buyer in that sense, i.e. they own other email software kind of properties, right? Within their portfolio. The other company was a holding company, so slightly different kind of prospect. And I think the biggest change and difference, except for valuation at that stage, between the 2 was the fact that in the holding company, I would have still held a significant stake of Conversio myself, significant minority at least. So they would have acquired a majority, but I would have had a significant kind of minority still.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Versus Conversio so it sounds like a truly financial buyer in the holdco, where you were going to roll some equity into the deal, and then Conversio was more of a strategic acquirer.
Yep.
Got it. But I guess my point was, some people who would get offers that met their expectations, because it sounds like you were expecting 2 to 3 in that space, and that's kind of what you got in the first round. Some people would be like, fantastic, I got my number. Like, where do I sign the document? That wasn't your reaction. So why did you feel there was more value to capture?
Yeah, I guess just faith in the system, right? I think having a system or a process proposed by someone like Einar, right, who was a recommendation from Rob, who's a friend who I've known for ages, like that has gravitas, right? I think that's the first thing. Having that process effectively kind of vetted by someone like Dan Martell, who's sold, I think Dan has sold 3 of his companies as well, right? And has advised many other SaaS founders.
So both Dan and Einar are saying, okay, let's go. Don't accept the first number.
Exactly right. So like, don't accept the first number, negotiate. And that's why you have multiple people in that kind of bidding process. So I think at that stage, like maybe it's ignorance, maybe it's somewhat just kind of youthfulness almost. But it is trust in that system, right? Trust in that process, trust that if you do this and you do this well, there is at least some upside. Like knowing, like, can you double the first offer? Don't know, right? Is it a 5% increase? Don't know, but there is at least this belief that the first offer is not the last offer.
And so what happened next?
Yeah, so I think that the best thing that's ultimately ended up happening, and without incriminating myself here, but the thing that Einar, and incriminating not in a criminal manner, but Einar always told me that, Adii, when you go on this call and you speak to these potential acquirers, you can speak to them about anything, right? Speak to them about your love of wine, if that's what they want to kind of chat to you about, right? The only thing you're not allowed to ever speak to them about is numbers, right? Like, speak to them about the company numbers, never about valuation. If they ask about valuation, tell them, well, they'll have to talk to Einar about that. So after every call, I actually just went back to Einar and I said, listen, this is where we got, this is what we chatted about. And he said, okay, good. And then he went off and he had separate conversations with the acquirer. So I actually, come to think of it now that you asked that, I don't have much visibility into how those conversations went. I don't know, like, whether Einar just said, listen, guys, like, you have to up this by X, right? Or like, I was just not involved in that part of the conversation.
Were you asked about valuation by either of the two bidders?
yeah, all by those and others that were interested.
How would it be
not
couched?
as far.
What kind of questions would they ask you?
I think well, literally just like, Adii, how do we at what kind of number do we get a deal done here, right? Because I think
How would you answer that?
I would just in the same way that I just answered you, right? Which is, hey guys, the deal, I would always be lighthearted about, right? And I would tell the story. I would say, listen here, Einar forbids me to speak about valuation. You'll have to chat to him about it, right? And I would just do this just downplay it and say, there's Einar, chat to him. I'm not allowed
and
to
did they
speak
push you? And they're like, Adii, Einar works for you, doesn't he?
Yeah, and I think the reason that they kind of respect that is they also knew, everyone involved in the process knew we were running a process. So they kind of, I think if you sell a business, you can totally overplay your hand in this. But as a seller, you have the asset that someone else wants. So, and if you have multiple people involved, they don't necessarily know who the other bidders are or to what extent they want this asset. And I think thus, you as the seller, you have some leeway to impose some rules of the game, some rules of engagement. And one of our rules of engagement was just that, yes, this is my company. Yes, this is ultimately going to be kind of, my decision, but you need to chat to, Einar about valuation. And we never got pushback on that, at least. Yeah.
Did Einar forbid you to talk about the other material deal points like earnout, stock versus cash? Were they all in the you got to talk to Einar bucket, or were
no? So those things were, and much of that we negotiated after LOI, at least. So the LOI, I think, was light on those kinds of details, but those were details that I was part of those discussions.
Got it. So what happened to the offers? I mean, were you able to get them up at all, or what was the final?
Yeah, so from first LOI to final LOI, we got about 35, just a little more than 35% higher. So running the process, created a lot of extra value.
That's incredible. Congratulations.
Thanks.
That's amazing. Good for you. It's life-changing money in the grand scheme of things. That you were. How did you celebrate? Was there a trophy? Did you buy a new house? I mean, this is a big deal.
Yeah. So we initially as a family, we didn't celebrate by buying things. I think the thing that it was interesting, at least given hindsight now, what we did decide to do was probably now about 3 years ago, 2018. I'd never been on a cruise at all, and we did a Disney cruise in the Mediterranean with the kids. And I remember back then, my wife sold me on the idea or convinced me that we should do it, and I was like, I'm not that convinced. My sea legs aren't it's 50-50. Firstly, secondly, can I handle Mickey Mouse for a whole week? And at that stage, my boys were 4 and 7, and it ended up being a magical week for us as a family. So what we did, kind of post acquisition, is we committed to taking my whole extended family. So I've got 2 younger sisters, my parents, and one of my sisters also has 2 young girls, and we committed to taking the whole family on a Disney cruise, which should have been June last year, but then pandemic hit, so we never did that, unfortunately. And at this stage, it's still TBC whether we can still do that. What ended up happening though, John, is I don't think, and again, I don't want to be disingenuous about this. I don't think my wife and I are flashy kind of people at all. We have a lovely home. We live in a kind of beautiful, it's called a polo estate. Polo, so that's just kind of golf estates in the winelands of Cape Town. What we ended up doing shortly after, and just before pandemic as well, we took transfer of a beach house just before South Africa went into our first lockdown. And many people know buying a holiday home is probably the worst financial kind of decision you can ever make, right? There's no financial return on that unless you get a ridiculous buyer coming in offering you silly money for it. But we bought a house on the beach, and I don't know whether it's just the year that we had, but as a family, we spent a lot of time together, and it's probably been one of the best purchases. Like this, it's not even just the money part, but really just the best thing that we've added to our life in a long time. So, and that would not have been possible had the acquisition not occurred. So I guess, as I said, that came a couple of months after the acquisition, kind of, but that's probably a great, I think, memento, and a physical memento as well of, kind of building a business and selling it for kind of life-changing money.
I love that. I'm a huge fan of having a physical reward trophy, because I think you work so hard, and it is, in your case, what a wonderful physical memory of what you've contributed, because you enjoy it with your family all the time. I think that's really sage. This has been incredible. I'm grateful. I should ask you, I feel like that was like the disingenuous close, to use your word. One question I didn't ask that I should have, related to the final deal. How did you net out on some of the other deal points, like earnout, stock versus cash? Like what can you share with us about that stuff? Yeah,
so I'm fortunate in the sense that I had a simple earnout that was not performance related, at least, that required me to stay with Campaign Monitor for a year, post close, and I ultimately end up kind of leaving about 14 months after closing. So I think that I would say I was fortunate, and I'm really grateful for kind of, I think, the way Campaign Monitor conducted themselves as an acquirer in that sense. I think it was, kind of mostly very founder friendly. I've heard much worse. Let me say that. Like, I don't think everything, for example, worked out as all of us had hoped or planned, at least, right? But really, in terms of how, and again, this is not me blowing smoke at their ass, but how they treated me as a founder selling a business, like, I think there's a lot to be said about that. It was kind of very honorable to that extent, and to that, I think, my earnout was not a nightmare, as I've heard from many other founders.
Let me get this straight. So your earnout was tied simply to your employment, like you agreed to stay on for a period of time, and if you met that threshold, then you got your extra tranche or whatever.
Exactly.
Wow. And then what about stock versus cash?
Yeah, so my deal was about half in that sense, and I still have the stock that I have. I'm still holding that. And
that's a privately held company, is that correct? Is there any liquidity on that stock? Like, how would that stock become liquid for you?
Hopefully in future it becomes liquid. I mean, I guess I'm not super familiar with how this kind of works, right? But the whole kind of the Greater Campaign Monitor Group is held by, or the majority owner at least, is Inside Partners, is a private equity firm. So I believe that the kind of liquidity it's always on the horizon, right? What that horizon kind of looks like, I don't know, right? But I think that is the hope, that either there is a sale there, outright sale, and there's liquidity there, or that there is some opportunity for some secondary sale of some sorts.
Do you have any put options? Meaning, do you have any rights to put your shares to the private equity group and say, like, I want out, like I want fully out? Is that an option at all?
It is an option to the extent that I can negotiate that, but there's no kind of agreed upon option, put option in place there. Got
it. Okay, great. What are you doing now? Like, where can be, I'm sure you're going to want to, people are going to want to reach out to you. So tell me a little bit about the book and where people can reach you.
Yeah, so I mean, just as we're recording this, John, a couple of weeks ago, I released my new book. It's called Life Profitability: The New Measure of Entrepreneurial Success.
Adii, you got to do that slow. You got to do it slowly, because I didn't understand it. Say the name of the book again.
Yeah, By the way, my wife constantly tells me, speak slower. So
Well, especially because the accent is unique to my ear, and then you're like speaking really quickly, and I'm like, whoa, what was that? So go slowly, one more time.
I'll go slowly. So the book is called Life Profitability, the New Measure of Entrepreneurial Success. And the kind of core idea of the book, very much based on my journey with Conversio. And this, I think the mission of building a business that's not just financially profitable in the narrow sense of the word, but truly kind of life profitable in the more kind of broader, diverse, holistic sense of the word. So managed to release the book a couple of weeks ago, became an Amazon bestseller within 48 hours, which was incredible. Thank you. And that was a kind of process. Like I started working on the book shortly after selling to Campaign Monitor, worked on it as a kind of nights and weekends project with a publishing team. So that's been exciting, kind of in the recent past. And then I have also just kind of started up building a new software, kind of new SaaS company, new software for all my sins. It's called Cogsy, and we staying in the kind of the realm of e-commerce. Cogsy helps e-commerce brands make better smarter purchasing decisions for their inventory, ultimately helping them optimize their working capital. So just gone through raising a small pre-seed round of funding and getting the first version into beta customers' hands. So that's called Cogsy. So that's very exciting. Well, for anyone that wants to follow what I'm doing, by the way, the best place to go to is adii.me. That's my blog, adii.me. And I think what is interesting there is I'm building Cogsy in public, which means I'm sharing the behind the scenes things of what's going on. And crucially, like many other entrepreneurs in my space, at least do this as well. What I actually hope to do is I hope to create some accountability where readers would call me on my bullshit when I'm doing these things and I'm working too hard and I'm not doing this in a life profitable way. Because I think I like many of the ideas that I have, like they are learnings in hindsight, and I now want to put it to practice in a new business and kind of go from building Conversio in a way and now doing that better with Cogsy and doing it in a way, as I said, that is truly life profitable.
Awesome. Life Profitability is the name of the book.
That's it.
Cogsy, the name of the company. Adii, it was a great pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, John.
Hey, if you like today's episode, you're going to love my new book, The Art of Selling Your Business. The book was inspired by the cohort of my guests over the years who have been able to negotiate an exit far better than the benchmark in their industry, sometimes 2 or 3 times more than I would have expected. I was curious to understand the tactics and strategies of these entrepreneurs and what they do differently from average performers. The result is a playbook for punching above your weight when it comes to selling your business. To learn more, go to builttosell.com/selling, where we put together a collection of gifts for listeners who order the book. Just go to builttosell.com/selling.
Thanks for listening to Built to Sell Radio with John Warrillow. For complete show notes with links to additional resources, visit builttosell.com/blog. John is the founder of the Value Builder System. To find out how to improve the value of your business by 71%, visit valuebuildersystem.com. John is also the author of Built to Sell, Creating a Business That Can Thrive Without You, and The Automatic Customer, Creating a Subscription Business in Any Industry. Connect with John at facebook.com/builttosell or on Twitter at John Warrillow, WARRILLOW. Thanks for listening.